Ferdinand the First, King of Naples. Ferdinand, what a name. You had so much promise, but then you had to go ahead and take the phrase keep your friends close, keep your enemies closer way too literally. Everyone was so excited when Ferdinand first became King of Naples. He was smart, courageous, confident, he had all the promise of being a wonderful king, but then the power must have gotten to his head or something, or he was really insecure, because soon his intent turned cruel and malicious, especially if you were on his bad side. Ferdinand liked to have dinner parties with his enemies and loved them so much he wanted them to stay forever. He would imprison them, even throw them out of windows before retrieving their corpse and staging them in what he called the Black Museum. I know, Black Mirror, right? He had them embalmed and then dressed in the clothing they wore while alive and placed at the dinner table like they were enjoying a banquet. To all those on his good side, his so-called Black Museum became a grim warning should he ever be crossed. If he suspected any of his subjects were going to betray him, he would even invite them to visit the museum so they could see where they might end up. Charming. Number 9. Hernan Cortez. There are several reasons as to why this man was the absolute worst of the time. The Spanish conquistador left blood wherever he went. 1. He decimated the Aztec Empire with his forces and slaughtered thousands of defenseless people. 2. He was rumored to have taken the life of his wife and enslaved over 20 Mesoamerican women to be his concubines against their will. Yay. 3. He also exploited Aztec and indigenous political systems for his own gain, even imprisoning a king in his own home. Number 4. He, along with his fellow explorers, gave them blankets, infecting the population with smallpox. Whether they knew this would happen remains up for debate. The history of colonialism is bloody and cruel in a lot of ways, with Hernan Cortez being one of the cruelest. It's strange to think that much of what we know today wouldn't exist without conquistadors like Cortez, but I always wish that things never went the way they did. But as many people on this list prove, we are not short on cruelty in the history of the world. Number 8. Emperor Zheng Da. So almost immediately, people didn't love this guy when he rose to power. Imagine being in a monarchy, it's just like a roll of the die. Is he gonna be crazy or is he gonna be sane? We just don't know. Firstly, there was a rumor that he wasn't a legitimate heir and that he was born by one of the queen's handmaidens, not the actual queen. But he took full advantage of his role and became one of the most notorious leaders during the Ming Dynasty. His court lived in constant fear, as many of his upright officials were purged and taken out. He didn't have much interest in courtly affairs and wanted instead to become a military general. He had a crowd of eunuchs that followed him everywhere, to whom he entrusted many government matters. They were very corrupt. He also liked to give orders to his imaginary double named General Zhu Shao. He left his court to be entirely run by his eunuchs, who allowed corruption and terror to breed, while he retired to pleasures in his own castle. He was also known for demanding cruel punishment, such as that which he did to one of his eunuchs, who wronged him. Number 7. King John. I'm actually reading a book about him and his brother right now, which is really interesting. King John wanted so badly to be remembered, but he just reeked so bad of desperation that he stunk up all of history. King John was so awful, he became immortalized as the main villain in the tale of Robin Hood. For a long time, John lived in the shadow of his terrifying and mighty older brother, Richard the Lionheart. But then Richard had to go off to reclaim the Holy Land, leaving the throne empty. Kind of. Despite attempts to prevent John from weaseling his way onto the throne in Richard's absence, John did so anyway, and no one could stop his cruelty. Richard died in 1199 from gangrene, and John began his reign. Let's see, where do we begin? Well, he took the life of his own nephew, he starved whoever he considered an enemy, including the wife of one of his best friends. He repeatedly retreated in battle because he was such a coward. He extorted and exploited his own country by enforcing ridiculous taxes and much more. He had to be forced to sign the Magna Carta, a charter of rights that remains one of the most pivotal documents in history. So needless to say, where his brother Richard established a legacy of heroism and valor, John did the exact opposite. Number 6. Attila the Hun. Attila? More like Atilla the Hun. He left a bloody and horrific legacy throughout his reign and conquest across Europe in the 5th century. Born in 406 AD, Attila was sent to the Roman court at the age of 12 as a hostage. Sometime between then and adulthood, Attila grew into a ruthless king who took the life of his own brother before embarking on his violent conquest. He pillaged over 100 cities and even arrived at the gates of Rome. It was his reign that plunged much of Europe into the Dark Ages. Like, he is responsible for that. The attacks his armies made were so horrifying that the name Attila became synonymous with chaos, destruction, and death. To the Romans, the Huns were barbarians led by the Scourge of God, yet another name for Attila. His rampage was so fast and vast that the empire just couldn't sustain itself. Eventually his rule ended, but there was a weird moment where a Roman princess named Honoraria sent him a ring and asked for him to help her escape. So there was like a weird romance happening. She was engaged to someone she didn't want to be married to, and she thought Attila was a better choice. I don't know. Attila claimed her as his betrothed, though he had like 20 wives already. God, leave some for the rest of them, you know? Though he was inevitably denied, he went on another bloody crusade because he was so heartbroken, but looks like he didn't really need that much encouraging. Number 5, Oskar Dirlewanger. The 36th Grenadier Division under the SS in World War II Germany was an experimental division that used hardened criminals as enforcers, and they were led by one horrendous man, Oskar Dirlewanger. He was a veteran from World War I and started out as a volunteer for the SS until he began to abuse his superiors. A 1942 Reich police said, and I quote, that he was a mentally unstable, violent fanatic and alcoholic who had the habit of erupting into violence under the influence of drugs. That was somebody from World War II Germany saying that about him. You know what I mean? They were so evil and they said that about him. Right? He was thrown in prison, and that should have been the last anyone heard of him. But then, SS official Gottlob Berger got a hold of him. They served together in World War I and they were buddies, and Berger pulled him from prison and sent him to fight. This led to his position as the leader of the Grenadier Division, aka the Dirlewanger Unit. His unit was made up of some of the worst criminals imaginable, and as a result, they were responsible for the torment of civilians without discrimination. All the most horrific things you can think of. Eventually though, Dirlewanger was captured by the French and handed off to the Polish to be finished off. They tormented him for days until he finally died on June 5th in 1945 from the injuries he sustained while being interrogated. So it feels like a fitting end in a weird way. So kind of satisfying, but because he was awful, truly. I left out a lot of the stuff, but just Google it. You'll see. Number 4, Michael Swango. This one, the case of Michael Swango is not only horrifying because of what he did, but also because of how long it took for him to get caught and for it to stop. It's insane. A serial poisoner, Michael Swango, swindled and lied his way into the medical field, leaving a trail of bodies behind him. First of all, this man kept a scrapbook of car crashes and horrific accidents, and even admired the poisoning techniques used in concentration camps in World War II. Red flags went off all over the place during his training in medical school, with patients mysteriously dying every time they touched him. He was nicknamed 007 with the catchphrase "License to Kill," but nobody did anything. In one case, one of the survivors directly implicated him when she said he injected her with something right before she underwent violent seizures. But he was exonerated because the hospital didn't want the press. Ugh. Then he was hired again and again at several places and poisoned staff on 2 separate occasions with first fried chicken and then donuts. He was caught, finally, sentenced to 5 years, released after 2 for unknown reasons, and then started working under aliases. He traveled to you can tell this makes me really mad. You can tell this makes me really mad because nobody did background checks. He traveled to Africa, and after a trail of bodies started turning up there, police found massive stores of poison in his home. Oh yeah, and before he left for Africa, he stole all of his girlfriend's money and she took her own life because of it. He was finally caught in 1997 and is serving 3 consecutive life sentences. Number 1, Lenin. The worse, the better. Vladimir Lenin is one of the most controversial people on this list. A kind of inspirational tyrant, Vladimir Lenin founded the Russian Communist Party, led the Bolshevik Revolution, and was the mind behind the Soviet state. He has in fact been regarded as one of the greatest revolutionary leaders in history, so like why the heck is he on this list? Lenin's Soviet Union led the way for people such as Joseph Stalin to oppress and brutalize their own people by establishing a society that suffocated freedom. One of the most horrific events he was responsible for was the Red Terror. The Red Red Terror was a state-sponsored wave of cutthroat brutality that spanned from September 1918 until 1922. In an attempt to maintain control, Lenin's Bolsheviks used terror to silence any opposition. Thousands, even millions potentially, were forced into concentration camps, which ended in their execution. Lenin's foundation of state-sanctioned violence would lead to millions of deaths throughout his leadership, and of course his predecessors, especially Joseph Stalin. So that's why he's number 1.
Starting off this list in our number 10 spot, we have H.H. Holmes. This one is like the least fun double whammy ever, as this covers an evil doctor as well as America's first serial killer. Great, awesome combo. H.H. Holmes was a real piece of work, and it is said that his fascination with medicine started at a young age, as he used to perform fictional surgeries on his stuffed animals. I just played with rocks, but alright. While it has never been confirmed, it is highly believed that his first victim may have been his childhood friend. H.H. Holmes went on to go to medical school, and shortly after finishing he began killing people in order to steal their property. He then built himself a huge, horrifying home that he had built to include things like secret passages and trapdoors, soundproof rooms, doors that locked from the outside with gas jets on the inside, and he even had a kiln to cremate the bodies. I think it's safe to say he was absolutely terrifying and just the worst guy. Not only would he get close to women to take control of their finances and then kill them, but he would also require his employees to take out life insurance policies that named him as the beneficiary. Some of the bodies he even ended up selling to medical schools. Eventually he was found out, caught, and sentenced to death. It isn't exactly known how many victims he had, but it's thought to be somewhere over 200.
Number 9. Thomas Cream. This next one hits close to home for us in Canada. Thomas Cream originally graduated from McGill in 1876, and after that he traveled to London, England, not London, Ontario, that's important. This was during the time of the Industrial Revolution, so the demand for doctors was quite high. Thomas was there for business and apparently pleasure as well. He enjoyed London's nightlife. He would dance and drink and hook up with strangers, just all the things you want your medical doctor doing hours before a shift. Neat. But on November 15th, 1892, there were thousands gathered outside of the Newgate prison walls, eagerly awaiting the execution of one Dr. Thomas Cream. Well, now he's referred to as the Lambeth Poisoner. Cool nickname, not really, it's terrifying. If you had the misfortune of seeing this doctor, odds are he would just have tried to poison you just because he likes it. He actually did get caught once. He was convicted of poisoning a woman. He was given a life sentence in prison, but it's all about who you know, right? His brother bribed the governor of Illinois, so he poisoned 5 more people in London before eventually getting arrested again and then finally executed for a large crowd.
In our number 8 spot today we have Harold Shipman. Harold became a general practitioner in Lancashire, England after graduating from medical school, but in 1975 he ended up going into rehabilitation for a substance issue and for the writing of fraudulent prescriptions of the specific drug. In 1977 he ended up moving and starting a general practice that was doing quite well, but then some astute member of the community realized that Harold's patients were dying at quite high rates. Eventually the case was passed on to the police, and it was at first believed that Harold should be cleared of all suspicion, until the death of an 81-year-old under mysterious circumstances. Her family demanded an investigation because they noticed that her insurance beneficiary had been changed to Harold, which reeked of forgery, as well as the fact that she had died shortly after a home visit from him, despite her being completely fine before his arrival. They ended up exhuming the body and found that she had actually passed away from a morphine overdose, and the timing of that overlapped with the time Harold had been in the home. After further investigation, it was also realized that Harold also encouraged all of the families of those who passed to cremate the bodies, as well as he jumped through a ton of hoops to assure them that the cause of death he wrote down was the true and real cause. Anyway, to make a long story short, he was the worst, and thankfully he was finally caught. He was tried and convicted of 15 counts of his crimes, but after his conviction, an audit estimated his number of victims to be around 236. In our number 6 spot today we have Arnfinn Nesset. Arnfinn wasn't exactly yet a doctor, but he was studying to be one, so we'll let it slide for today. At the time of his crimes, he was actually a nurse, and he ended up being charged for taking the lives of 22 different people. It is said said that he committed these horrific crimes by injecting patients with a certain muscle-relaxing drug. This worked particularly well because of the fact that this is a drug which over time becomes very hard to trace in the body. This not only worked to conceal the fact that he was committing these crimes for quite some time, but once people did catch on, it became very hard to prove his guilt. The investigations into his crimes took 2 years and his trial ended up lasting 5 months. He was sentenced to only 21 years in prison because in Norwegian law, this is the maximum someone can be given, even if they're being sentenced for the killing of 22 people. Apparently he was released from prison in 2004 and he then changed his name, and last I could find he was living somewhere in Norway. How terrifying.
Number 5. Jane Toppan. It's the 1800s and Jane Toppan, aka Jolly Jane, is confessing to 31 murders. With that nickname and that many victims, I already know you're gonna be sick to your stomach. Jolly Jane Toppan was a nurse working in Massachusetts. She would take care of the elderly, but instead of TLC, Jane would give them morphine and atropine, and then while they were slowly fading away, Jane would do the absolute creepiest thing that I've ever heard in my entire life. She would poison these old folks and then lie in their bed with them as they were passing away. I got goosebumps reading this whole thing. Okay, she managed to cuddle away the souls of 31 patients before eventually getting caught. This one did get caught. She's not like out there still, thankfully. She spent the remainder of her days laying alone, thankfully, in an asylum.
In our number 4 spot today we have John Bodkin Adams. John was kind of similar to old Harold Boy we already talked about in the fact that he liked to not only kill his patients, but also commit fraud by making sure there was money or other valuables being left for him in their wills. Like, how do these people not realize how obvious that is? I like my doctor, but not enough to gift him my house after I die. It is said that from 1946 to 1956, John had around 160 patients that died suspiciously, and that out of those 160, 132 of them left valuables for him. Of course, the wills were later found out to be fraudulent, because, yep. Want to know something wild though? John was acquitted. How? I'm not really sure, but his trial established the doctrine of double effect, which is where a doctor giving treatment with the aim of relieving pain may lawfully, as an unintentional result, shorten life. How insane is that? Anyway, that makes me upset.
Number 3. Jayant Patel. After training in India, Jayant became a surgeon in 1984. He began his career in Buffalo, New York. Great place to start. But it didn't take long for him to be fined. He was placed on probation for 3 years because he wouldn't check up on his patients before operating on them, which is insane. So later on, he was able to return, but his new coworkers witnessed him operating on their patients. The guy wouldn't even look at his own medical roster. He would just go to them and just start poking around for no reason. And a lot of the time, it would lead to their patient's death or serious injury. In 1998, he was prohibited from operating on the liver or pancreas, and when it came to any other surgery, he had to get a second opinion to go forward. This restriction was statewide come 2000 because 3 out of 4 cases ended up biting the bullet later on. He kept getting hired though, still over and over, hiding his past of course, but eventually come 2013, Patel pleaded guilty to 4 charges of fraud. He served 2 years in prison only. That's a nice fact to end on. And number 1, Linda Hazard. Her last name really tried to warn us. She has since been dubbed the starvation doctor because back in the day, the late 1800s of course, if you somehow ended up in the office of Hazard, it doesn't really matter what you're suffering with. Linda's advice, her medical advice to pretty much for everything was just to fast. Yeah, broken collarbone you say, skip lunch. More than 40 of her patients died due to, yep, starvation, and she had her own sanitarium in Washington appropriately named Starvation Heights. Sounds like a great place to go and heal. You would think after 16 deaths caused by starvation at Starvation Heights, people would start asking questions. Wow, weird. Eventually, Major Chip Hazard was caught, convicted, served 2 years in prison, and then 26 years later in 1938, she herself died of starvation. You played yourself.
Number 9, Farid Fata. This is horrendous. This is absolutely horrendous. Imagine being told that you were sick and dying and then finding out later it was all a lie. Farid delivered the news to over 500 people, what's supposed to be what every doctor dreads to say, that they were sick and dying. He sent them through various rounds of chemotherapy, radiation, you name it. The thing is, they weren't sick to begin with. Farid had figured out that he could make millions of dollars off of people participating in these treatments. So while he moved into his million-dollar mansion, his healthy patients suffered horrific side effects from the medications such as losing their teeth, hair, their strength, etc. If you've ever seen anybody go through cancer treatment, you know it's not amazing at all. His genuinely sick patients died with no care, while his healthy ones got sicker and sicker and eventually just ended up being sick. He would give them hope that they were getting better just to keep them stuffing his pockets. The families also suffered with the impending death of their family members, all for nothing. Finally, the truth came out due to information from a suspicious colleague and authorities caught up to him. Prosecutors sought an 175-year sentence but settled with 45. Good riddance. And also what really pisses me off about this one is that he got away with it for so long and there was no criticism over like 500 people. That's a lot of people. Ugh, bothers me so much. Let's keep going. Number 8. This one's a little controversial. Oliver Cromwell. Yeah, I know. I don't know. I feel like I'm risky, you know what I mean? He wasn't a very nice guy. Sure, he did some good, but he decimated a lot of people and he abolished theater, which is a big no in my books. After the Civil War, Cromwell took over as protector of England. For most of his rule, he was pretty much viewed as a dictator. Some believe that he saved democracy, but his means of getting there were brutal and unrelenting. In September 1649, Cromwell's men entered the town of Drogheda and took the lives of everyone they found, which means around 3,500 innocent people died. He acted as God's executioner, his contempt for Catholics feeding the attacks. He was quite brutal to Ireland. Many historians accuse him of ethnic cleansing, especially since a month after Drogheda he did the same thing to Wexford. Eventually he was overthrown by Charles II and his republic failed. And there is some missing nuance, I will admit, so if you want to go ahead and correct me in the comments or go into a debate, go for it. Why not? But there was quite a bit of bad and we can't really ignore that. Not a nice guy. Number 7. Marshall Applewhite. Now we have our first cult leader. Woo! Just kidding, not an appropriate response considering how awful he was. Marshall Applewhite was an infamous leader of the Heaven's Gate cult. His first arrest was a little tame. He was arrested when he failed to return a car that he rented. His reason was that he was divinely authorized to own the car. He had some pretty extravagant disillusions and an inflated perspective of self, as cult leaders often do. He manipulated several people to join his cult and participate in a procedure requiring surgical castration. He made everyone wear baggy clothes and was convinced that they were waiting for a UFO to arrive. The Haley-Bob comet was the signal and Applewhite organized a last supper of sorts. They all went to a restaurant and ordered the same thing: turkey pot pie, cheesecake, blueberries, and iced tea. Not my choice, honestly. Finally, on March 21st, when the comet was days out, he manipulated 30 people to take their own lives. Number 6. The Serpent. I'm a big fan of Jenna Coleman, who played Clara in Doctor Who, and when she showed up in the new Netflix show The Serpent, like, I was in. But then I was horrified to learn that it was about a real human that existed, and I really wish they didn't. Charles Sobrage, along with his girlfriend Marie-Andre Leclerc, committed a spree of crimes along what was called the Hippie Trail. During the 1970s, Vietnamese, Indian, Frenchmen lured over a dozen tourists into a false sense of security before taking their lives. He preyed upon travelers in India, Nepal, and Thailand by spiking their drinks, food, stealing their valuables and identities before brutally making them disappear. He became the subject of a massive Interpol manhunt in 1976 after a junior diplomat in Bangkok started to catch on. If his crimes were anywhere as brutal as they were hinted at in the show, I certainly wish he never existed. Thankfully, he continues to serve a life sentence to this day. Number 5. Dennis Rader. I'm surprised that I haven't added him to this list earlier, but I needed to do a part 7, so I guess here we are. The BTK killer. The man not only known for taking the lives of 10 victims, but for how he did it. Between 1974 to 1991, he baffled police with his violent crimes in Wichita, Kansas. BTK was used to describe how he took their lives. I'll have to ask you to look that up because YouTube gets mad at me when I say those words, but I think you can guess that he took his time and he did it viciously. What's even worse is he had everyone fooled into thinking he was a kind, family-loving, God-fearing man. He disappeared after taking his last victim in 1991, but he returned a few years later annoyed that no one had caught him and that the press had died down. In 2004, on the anniversary of one of his crimes, the Otero family, Dennis sent a floppy disk to the police. This helped police track him down to his church, but But even then, it wasn't until 2005 that he was finally arrested and sentenced to 10 life sentences. One per victim, I guess. I think we know why he's on this list. Number 4, Ed Kemp. Good old Eddie Kemp. Again, weird that I haven't added him to this list sooner. A weird kind of evil because he actually ended up giving authorities a ton of information on psycho killers. But alas, he haunts my dreams and I just really wish we didn't have to worry about men like him. I've said it before, I'll say it again. I will take ghosts, ghouls, poltergeists, whatever over human beings any day. He had a strange talent for making people believe he was a gentle giant, all while committing 10 of the most gruesome crimes. With an IQ of 145, he easily manipulated his victims into trusting him before it was the last thing they ever did. Standing at 6'9" and weighing 250 pounds, he used both brawn and brains to overpower the women he took. He showed obvious signs of pathological need to kill from a young age, starting with the family cat all the way to unaliving his paternal grandparents at age 15. You get the gist. Even then, he was able to convince mental health professionals to let him go early. He was charming. He was easy to get along with. He was likable. And he did this. From 1972 to 73, Ed used the line, "Ugh, I don't have all day," to convince hitchhikers to enter his car, implying he was in a rush, put pressure on them, and convinced them that he didn't have time to kill them. They also never caught him. He turned himself in before they could. Number 3, Ted Bundy. Yeah, we're hitting some heavy hitters today. Men like Ted Bundy are the reason women carry keys in between their fingers when they walk at night, or like the reason we cross the street. It's honestly men like some of the ones I mentioned already. Born on November 24th, 1946, who would have known the man he would become? By all accounts, he had a good family, but at an early age he was already showing dark tendencies. He would spy on unsuspecting women and accumulated an extensive juvenile record, which was wiped clean when he turned 18. He was going to be a lawyer, but soon gruesome deaths spread throughout the nation. He tended to prey on young, attractive college women from Washington, Utah, Colorado, and Florida. He would use his looks and charm to lure them into his clutches or ask them to help him with his books. He would strike them over the head, force them into the vehicle, and drive away to carry out the rest of the deed. He confessed to taking the lives of 36 victims, but alluded that there may have been more, closer to 100. His court case was an absolute media frenzy, because no one could believe such a charming, attractive man, he's not that good looking, could be capable of such horrible things. But suddenly the world was shown. Evil wears a pretty face. Number 2, Andrew Philip Cahoe. Things could have gone either way for Andrew. He loved helping people, but also was quick to anger. Considering he's on this list, we know which direction he went. When he was 14, the stove exploded, setting his mother on fire. Andrew watched her burn a little too long before he grabbed some water and put it out, but by that point it was just too late. Andrew showed the telling signs of darkness through his cruelty towards animals, once beating a horse to death. He married a wealthy woman named Ellen Price in 1911, but despite this, the couple fell into debt. Ellen got TB, pushing them further into debt until finally, at long last, Cahoe snapped. On May 18, 1927, Cahoe took Ellen's life by hitting her in the head. He set the barn on fire with explosives. He had previously placed explosives around the Bath school, and after he burnt down the barn, he drove over and detonated the bombs at the school, killing basically everyone who was inside. Then he filled his truck up with more explosives, admitted the crime in front of everybody, and then detonated the truck with a Winchester rifle while he was inside. Number 1, Jean Bedel Bokassa, one of Africa's most brutal dictators, and was even accused of consuming human flesh and even feeding his opponents to animals. He was the self-crowned emperor of the Central African Republic until he was kicked out in 1979. His coronation alone bankrupted his own country, as it basically cost the entire GDP. He took all of the government posts for himself and established what has been referred to as a reign of terror. He personally oversaw brutal beatings and made the rule that thieves should have their ears cut off. He arrested school patrons for not wearing uniforms made in the factory he owned, and even had 100 of them executed. In 1980, he was finally sentenced to death in absentia, though he decided to return to Africa in 1986. Why he was allowed to, no idea. From there he was tried again for his crimes, but he never faced the death penalty. Instead, he just went to jail, and he was released in 1993, then he died, and then he was pardoned in 2010. What? Why was he pardoned? He was literally the worst.